This is the oldest temple unearthed anywhere on this planet.
I spent much of the 90s and the late 1980s investigating this issue of a lost civilization. I wrote a series of books about it.
What he discovered was mind-blowing. After discovering the first T-shaped pillar buried at the site, he soon found more of these massive structures.
Archaeologists just pulled something out of the ground in southern Turkey that has left the entire scientific community in stunned silence. Not a coin, not a fragment of pottery, not another carved animal on stone. A human being, deliberately entombed inside the wall itself.
Göbekli Tepe itself was the end of a process, not the beginning of a process. It was something that marked, it was a marker. It was something that brought together the best of everything that they'd accumulated and created it in one place.
Positioned, preserved, and placed there with terrifying intentionality, more than 12,000 years ago. And when researchers ran the latest 2026 data through ground-penetrating radar and artificial intelligence imaging systems, what they found beneath the soil didn't just add a chapter to history, it threatened to tear the entire book apart. We are standing at the edge of what may be the single greatest archaeological revelation of the modern era.
It wasn't until German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited the site and began digging. They realized what was really at this site.
And what makes it truly extraordinary is this. The people who built this place may have known we would find it. They may have left it for us on purpose. This is the story of Göbekli Tepe. And in 2026, it is no longer the story we thought we knew. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to question everything you were ever taught about the origins of human civilization.
So what's emerging as a result, if Göbekli Tepe hadn't been found, none of this would have happened.
What is Göbekli Tepe, and why should you care? Let's establish something important before we go any further. Most people, when they hear the word ancient, think of the Egyptian pyramids. They think of Rome. They think of Greece. Those civilizations feel impossibly old, don't they? The pyramids of Giza were built roughly 4,500 years ago. The Colosseum in Rome was constructed around 2,000 years ago. Now double the age of the pyramids. Then double it again. That is how old Göbekli Tepe is. Located on a limestone ridge in the Şanlıurfa region of southeastern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, which translates to Potbelly Hill, was first excavated in the 1990s by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt. What he found shattered the established timeline of human civilization in a way that the academic world is still struggling to process decades later. Giant T-shaped stone pillars, some standing nearly 6 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons each, arranged in precise circular enclosures. Every surface covered in intricate, deliberate carvings: foxes, vultures, scorpions, snakes, bulls, lions, and dozens of abstract symbols whose meaning had, until recently, remained frustratingly out of reach. This structure was built more than 12,000 years ago, not by a known civilization, not by farmers or city dwellers. According to everything we thought we understood about prehistoric humanity, by hunter-gatherers, by people who weren't supposed to be capable of organized, large-scale construction, by people we had always assumed were too busy surviving to build anything that would outlast them by 100 centuries. Göbekli Tepe didn't just challenge that assumption, it demolished it. And now, in 2026, the latest round of discoveries has taken that demolition to an entirely new level. The discovery that started the 2026 shockwave. To understand why 2026 is such a turning point, you need to understand what happened in the months leading up to it. In late 2025, archaeologists working at Göbekli Tepe made 2 back-to-back discoveries that sent the field into a frenzy. First, they unearthed a near life-sized human statue, but not positioned the way you would expect, not standing, not seated, not placed on a pedestal like an object of worship. This statue was embedded horizontally into the foundation wall of one of the stone enclosures. Its head and torso were intact. Its lower legs were deliberately absent, cut away or simply never carved. And the way it was positioned, the angle, the depth, the orientation of the face, it looked less like decoration and more like a burial, as if someone had placed a person inside the wall, as if they wanted that presence to stay there forever. Take a moment with that image. 12,000 years ago, someone carried this figure, carefully, deliberately, and sealed it into the structure they were building. Why? What does it mean when you entomb a likeness of a human being inside your foundation wall and then cover it so it cannot be seen? Were they sealing something in? Or keeping something out? Then, just weeks later, at Karahan Tepe, the nearby sister site that is increasingly understood to be part of the same vast ritual network as Göbekli Tepe, excavators made an equally startling find. A T-shaped pillar unlike any seen in 3 decades of excavation, because carved into its surface with unmistakable clarity and stunning skill was a human face. Not an abstract representation, not a symbol, a face, deep-set eyes, a strong straight nose, a defined jawline, the specific individual features of a real person, rendered in stone with the kind of care that tells you this was not casual work. This was sacred work. For the first time in 12,000 years, humanity was looking directly at the face of someone who lived in the Stone Age, someone who walked that ridge, someone who dragged those pillars up that hill and carved their world into rock because they believed, with everything they had, that it needed to be remembered. Who was that person? What did they know that we have forgotten? These are not rhetorical questions, because in 2026, we started getting answers, and the answers are more disturbing than the questions. What the technology found underground. Here is where the story shifts from archaeology into something that feels more like science fiction, except that it is entirely real. Following the 2025 discoveries, the research team made a decision. Rather than continuing to dig manually, a process that is slow, irreversible, and limited by what the human eye can see, they deployed a suite of modern scanning technologies across the entire Göbekli Tepe region simultaneously. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, light detection and ranging, high-resolution magnetic field surveys, the same technologies used in deep-sea exploration and military reconnaissance, now pointed at a limestone hill in Turkey to see what 12,000 years of soil had been hiding. They cleared the olive groves that had grown over much of the hillside. They mapped the terrain at a level of detail no previous survey had ever achieved. And then they looked at the results. What came back left the team struggling for words. Beneath the surface, far more than anyone had imagined, were structures, dozens of them. New circular enclosures similar to those already excavated. Rectangular structures with layouts that suggest organized living spaces, storage areas, or functional buildings of a kind no one had expected to find at a site this old. Passages, chambers, a sprawling, interconnected network that extended far beyond the boundaries of what had been excavated or even theorized. The picture that emerged was not of an isolated ceremonial site. It was of a settlement, a complex, a hub. Göbekli Tepe was not a temple standing alone in the wilderness. It was the center of an entire world, and it was connected through a regional network that now appears to include Karahan Tepe, Taştepeler, Ayınlarhöyük, Sayburç, and at least a dozen other sites across the region, to a cultural system of extraordinary scale and coordination. Sites built in the same era, using similar methods, following similar symbolic conventions, all apparently linked to one another in ways that imply not just shared culture, but shared purpose. Think about what that means for a moment. Think about the logistical reality of coordinating construction across multiple sites spanning hundreds of square kilometers, at a time when humans were supposedly still living in nomadic bands, moving with the seasons, with no cities, no writing, no centralized government. How do you coordinate something like that without those things? Unless, and this is the question that is keeping archaeologists awake at night, those assumptions about what prehistoric people had and didn't have are simply wrong. What artificial intelligence found in the carvings? Now we get to the part of this story that, frankly, changes the game entirely. More than 2,500 high-resolution, three-dimensional images of 43 excavated T-shaped pillars, along with over 400 distinct animal figures, symbols, and abstract signs, were digitized and fed into a neural network system. An AI trained to do what human researchers, despite 30 years of dedicated work, had not been able to do: find patterns across the entire dataset simultaneously, without fatigue, without assumption, without the natural human tendency to see what we expect to see. What the AI found was extraordinary. The carvings were not random. They were not purely decorative. They were not simply the product of individual artisans expressing themselves freely. They followed rules. Foxes appeared in consistent groupings with specific sets of other symbols, not on one or two pillars, but across 9 different enclosures, in configurations that repeat with a regularity that cannot be coincidence. Snakes and scorpions occupied predictable fixed positions on the pillar surfaces. Certain compositional arrangements appeared only within specific enclosures, as though those enclosures had dedicated meanings, dedicated functions. And then the finding that has generated the most heated debate in the current academic literature. Some of the arrangements the AI calculated show correlations of over 80% with the positions of specific star constellations as they would have appeared in the night sky approximately 12,000 years ago. 80%. That is not noise. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern. What this suggests, and let us be careful here because this is still being debated, but the evidence is compelling, is that the people who built Göbekli Tepe were not just carving animals because animals were important to them. They were encoding information. They were building a recording system, a visual language carved into stone, designed to preserve knowledge and transmit it across time. If that interpretation holds, Göbekli Tepe was not simply a temple. It was a library. A stone library from the Stone Age, containing records of the sky, of catastrophic events, of astronomical observations made by people who were watching the heavens with a level of attention and sophistication that, until now, we assumed was thousands of years beyond them. Here is what you need to ask yourself. If they were sophisticated enough to encode astronomical data into a symbolic system spread across dozens of pillars, sophisticated enough that a 21st century artificial intelligence needed to be deployed to decode it, what else were they capable of that we still don't understand? The world they lived in and why they built. To truly understand what Göbekli Tepe meant to its builders, you need to step inside their world for a moment. 12,000 years ago, the Earth was not the stable, temperate planet we know today. It was a world in violent transition. The last ice age was ending. Glaciers that had covered vast portions of the northern hemisphere were retreating. Sea levels were rising, sometimes rapidly, swallowing coastlines and reshaping the geography of entire regions. The land that had once connected Britain to continental Europe was disappearing beneath the waves. Valleys that communities had lived in for generations were drowning. Entire ecosystems that people had spent millennia learning to read, the migration routes of animals, the fruiting patterns of plants, the seasonal rhythms of rivers, were shifting or vanishing altogether. And then, just as things seemed to be stabilizing, the Earth lurched into what geologists call the Younger Dryas, a sudden, brutal cold snap that lasted nearly 1,200 years. Temperatures plunged, growing seasons collapsed. The large animals that hunter-gatherer societies depended upon died in massive numbers. The forests contracted. The rivers changed course. The familiar world ended, more than once. Imagine living through that. Imagine watching everything your people knew: the hunting grounds, the fruit trees, the water sources, the landscape itself, transform beyond recognition within a single lifetime. Imagine trying to make sense of it. Imagine being the elder of your community, the keeper of the old knowledge, and finding that the old knowledge no longer works. The animals are not where they used to be. The plants do not grow where they used to grow. The rains do not come when they used to come. Everything you were taught, everything you memorized, everything you passed on, it is becoming obsolete in real time. Imagine trying to hold your community together when the ground beneath you, literally and metaphorically, will not stop shifting. What would you do? These people built. They organized hundreds of individuals across what must have been an enormous geographic area. They quarried stone pillars weighing up to 20 tons and moved them, without wheels, without metal tools, without draft animals in the way we understand them, to the top of a limestone hill. Researchers estimate that dragging a single one of those pillars from the quarry to the construction site would have required the coordinated labor of hundreds of people working for days. There is no casual explanation for that. No accidental community project. You do not move a 20-ton pillar across difficult terrain by accident. You do it because you have decided, collectively, that it must be done. They erected them with precision, and they spent enormous collective creative energy carving onto them everything they knew, everything they feared, and everything they wanted the future to remember. This was not the behavior of people who had given up. This was not random spiritual impulse. This was a civilization, and yes, that word is being used deliberately, responding to catastrophe with everything it had, with organization, with symbolism, with memory, with the understanding somehow that what they built would outlast them. Consider the sheer act of faith embedded in that choice. To carve something into stone is to believe in a future you will never see. To invest months or years of collective labor into a structure you know will outlive you requires a relationship with time that we rarely credit to people this far back in history. We assume linear progress, that the further back you go, the shorter the horizon people planned for. Göbekli Tepe destroys that assumption. These were people who thought in centuries, who built for strangers, who understood at some profound level that the work mattered more than the workers. They were right. It has outlasted them by 12,000 years. The question we are now being forced to ask is whether they also intended it to outlast them. Whether they were not just building for their present community, but building for us, for whoever came next, whoever would eventually dig down through the soil and find what they left behind. The three theories, and what they tell us about ourselves. The latest 2026 analysis has moved the scientific debate beyond simple questions of dating or function. Researchers are now grappling with three major theoretical frameworks, and what is remarkable is that these theories do not contradict one another. They may all be simultaneously true. The first theory holds that Göbekli Tepe was a house of the dead, a site devoted to ancestor veneration and the management of death at a communal level. The horizontally embedded statue fits this interpretation powerfully. In ritual practice across dozens of ancient cultures, the placement of a human figure, or a human body, inside a structural foundation was believed to bind a spirit to the place, to anchor an ancestor to the community, to keep the dead from leaving, and to draw upon their power and wisdom indefinitely. The missing lower legs of the statue reinforce this idea. This was not a figure meant to walk away. It was a figure meant to stay, rooted, immovable, permanent. The human face carved on the Karahan Tepe pillar supports it further. These were not symbols of abstract deities. These were real people, rendered with real specificity, because the people mattered. Their identity, their presence, their continued connection to the living community that mourned them and needed them. In a world without writing, without documents, without any formal system of recording the past, your ancestors were your history, your dead were your memory. To carve a specific face into stone, not a generic face, not a symbolic face, but a real face, with individual features that someone clearly knew and intended to preserve, was to refuse to let that person disappear. It was the most powerful statement a Stone Age community could make. This person existed. This person matters. They will not be forgotten. The second theory, increasingly supported by the AI analysis, centers on astronomy and catastrophic memory. The correlation between carved symbols and ancient star positions suggests that Göbekli Tepe may have functioned as an observatory and a cosmic record keeper. Pillar 56, with its imagery of surging waves and panicked, fleeing animals, has been interpreted by multiple researchers as a visual record of a catastrophic flood, possibly a memory of genuine coastline inundation during the rapid sea level rises of the post-glacial period. Pillar 18, with its stark, desperate composition, a symbol that some read as a cry for divine intervention, a plea for help from something beyond human comprehension, radiates panic in a way that, even in translation across 12 millennia, is difficult to look at without feeling. These were not decorations. These were records. These were warnings, carved in stone precisely because stone endures when everything else dissolves. When the floods come, when the cold returns, when the civilization that built the library is itself swallowed by time. The third theory, and perhaps the most humbling one, is that Göbekli Tepe was a social and intellectual center, a gathering place where dispersed hunter-gatherer groups from across a vast region came together to share knowledge, reinforce bonds, coordinate responses to environmental crisis, and build a collective identity. Think of it as the world's first conference, the world's first university, the world's first forum for the kind of organized, large-scale human cooperation that we tend to associate with cities and states and bureaucracies, except that it happened here, 12,000 years ago, before any of those structures existed. The scale of the complex, the evidence of regional connectivity, the sophistication of the symbolic system, all of it points to a level of social organization that we had not believed possible in this period of human history. And here is what makes this third theory so unsettling. If it is true, if Göbekli Tepe was a place where people gathered from hundreds of kilometers away to share knowledge and build community, then the people of 12,000 years ago were not primitive. They were not isolated. They were not incapable of abstract thought or long-range planning or spiritual complexity. They were, in the ways that matter most, exactly like us. We invented a story in which they were less than us. The evidence is now suggesting that story was always a fiction, and what that means, for our understanding of human potential, for our assumptions about what civilization requires, for the timeline we have been teaching in every school on Earth, is something the academic community is only beginning to grapple with. What is still buried and what might be coming? Here is a number that should stop you cold. More than 90% of the Göbekli Tepe complex remains unexcavated. Everything that has astonished the world, the T-shaped pillars, the carved animals, the human statue, the human face, the AI-decoded symbolic language, the underground structures revealed by radar, all of it represents less than 1/10 of what is actually there. The GPR and LiDAR scans are still processing. New structures are still being identified. The full extent of the regional network, the relationship between Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites, the degree of coordination between them, the possibility that there are more sites not yet found, is still being mapped. What we know in 2026 is almost certainly not what we will know in 2030 or 2035. And with every new discovery, the story gets larger, more complex, more difficult to contain within the frameworks we built to explain it. The rectangular structures found by the radar scans particularly intrigue researchers. In a site that was supposed to be purely ceremonial, a place of ritual, not residence, the presence of what appear to be living spaces and storage facilities suggests that people may have spent extended periods at Göbekli Tepe, not just visiting for rituals, living, working, teaching, learning, passing down the knowledge of how to read the sky, how to interpret the symbols, how to maintain the record that had been carved into those stones at such enormous cost. If there was a resident priestly class, or a class of knowledge keepers, scholars, specialists in the symbolic system, then we are not looking at a site where people gathered occasionally. We are looking at an institution, a place with permanent staff, with people whose entire life purpose was to maintain and transmit what had been built there. If Göbekli Tepe supported a resident population, even a rotating seasonal one, then it was not a temple, it was a city. Not a city in the way we typically envision it, with paved streets and market stalls, but a city in function. A place where large numbers of people came together with shared purpose, shared labor, and shared knowledge, and produced something that none of them could have produced alone. And if there was a city at the beginning of recorded human history, a city that predates every city we have ever named in our textbooks, then what does that do to the timeline we have been teaching for a century? What does it do to the story of human progress, the neat arc from primitive to advanced that we have been telling since the Enlightenment? What happens to that story when the most sophisticated thing our species ever encoded, a symbolic system so complex it required artificial intelligence to begin decoding it, turns out to predate writing by 7,000 years? The honest answer is that we don't yet know. The frameworks haven't caught up to the evidence. The textbooks haven't been rewritten. The curricula haven't changed. In classrooms around the world, the story of human civilization still begins in Mesopotamia, still credits the Sumerians with the first cities, still places the invention of writing at the starting line of what we call history. And somewhere beneath the soil of southeastern Turkey, 90% of a 12,000-year-old complex sits quietly in the dark, waiting to make that story obsolete. The message across time. There is a layer to this story that goes beyond archaeology and technology, a layer that is harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. These people, whoever they were, whatever language they spoke, whatever gods they worshipped, whatever they called themselves, they made a choice. They were living through the end of their world. The climate was breaking down. The animals were dying. The coastlines were moving. Their social networks were under stress. Everything they depended upon was changing faster than any single generation should have to absorb. And their response was to carve their knowledge into 20-ton stones on a hilltop in a way that they must have understood, at some level, would survive them by an enormous margin. They left a message. The statue in the wall, the face on the pillar, the symbols aligned to stars, the circular enclosures precisely placed, the entire vast network of sites connected across the region. None of this was accidental. None of this was careless. This was the most deliberate, most intentional thing a group of people under catastrophic stress could have done. They were saying, "We were here. This is what we knew. This is what we saw. This is what happened. Remember." And in 2026, we are finally, with every tool at our disposal, beginning to listen. The question that matters now is not just what were they trying to tell us. The question that keeps surfacing, the one that the researchers keep returning to in their papers and their interviews and their quiet conversations at the edges of excavation sites, is this. Did they know something about catastrophic change, about how civilizations collapse and how they survive, that we, with all our technology and all our comfort and all our certainty about the permanence of the world we have built, desperately need to hear? Because if they built this place in response to climate collapse, if they built it to preserve knowledge, to sustain community, to maintain identity in the face of a world that was falling apart, then perhaps the message they carved into that stone was not only meant for a future they imagined abstractly, perhaps it was meant for us. Specifically, now. We live in a world that is, once again, changing faster than we know how to process. Once again, familiar systems are under pressure. Once again, the question of how communities hold together, how knowledge gets preserved, how identity survives crisis, is not academic. It is urgent. And 12,000 years ago, on a hilltop in Turkey, a group of people who had no writing, No metal, no wheel, no cities, nothing we associate with civilization. Built something that has outlasted every empire that came after them, and encoded within it a set of answers to questions they may have known we would eventually be asking. Göbekli Tepe is no longer simply the world's oldest temple. In 2026, it is something far more extraordinary and far more troubling. It is a testament to human intelligence in extremis, a record of catastrophe and survival, a symbolic library that required artificial intelligence to begin reading, a network of sites that implies a level of social organization 12,000 years ago that rewrites the story of who we are and where we came from. And it is almost entirely still buried. More is coming. The scans are ongoing. The excavations are expanding. The AI analysis continues to process data that is only now being fully digitized. Within the next few years, it is not an exaggeration to say that what we know about Göbekli Tepe could change dramatically. Again. So here is what I want to know from you. Of the three theories, the House of the Dead, the Astronomical Observatory, the Great Social and Knowledge Center, which one do you find most compelling? Or do you think it was all three at once? Do you believe the builders of Göbekli Tepe were deliberately trying to send a message to future generations? And perhaps most importantly of all, do you think we are ready to hear it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and this is exactly the kind of conversation that a discovery of this magnitude deserves. If this video opened something up for you, if it made you see the ancient world differently, or made you question the history you were taught, then please like this video and subscribe to this channel. There is so much more of this story left to tell, and I am going to keep following it wherever it leads. Because Göbekli Tepe is still speaking, and we are only just beginning to understand the language. See you in the next one.